today's bit for you is about this idea of writing discursively. In other words, essentially, what I'm trying to do is look at the way you can write to best give yourself a chance of a level 6. Now, let me make this clear. You don't only get a level 6 if you write beautifully and perfect. In fact, you'll see some examples I'm going to show you today of people writing who've got full marks, and you can see that actually some of their grammar isn't particularly great. But what it does say to us is that we have a way that might help us, or things that might help us a little bit more. And one of those ways is to try and create your essay, turn your essay into a discussion, right? A debate, rather than just a repetition of key ideas. So that's what I'm going to look at kind of with you. Now, the sense of what I mean, therefore, by writing discursively is, and I got this from somewhere else as to what they consider writing discursively to be, is that if you're going to do that, you're going to formulate, first of all, a relevant response. You can't write discursively unless you've got a clear, relevant response. But the thesis we talked about before. You've got to be able to have a clear sense of organisation in your essay in order to be able to discuss it. You know, the spine that we've talked about many times before, and you'll have worked on at home, worked on with your teachers. But people who write discursively often use complex sentence structures as well. The use of a sentence structure to allow you to develop the flow of writing. And I'll see a few examples of that. And it's particularly, I would say, the use of subordination in there, using subordinate clauses to introduce things, and of embedded clauses, right? Dropping things in to the middle of what you're saying can be very effective to create that flow. They're looking for the good level of fluency, and they're looking for you to use that discussion to evaluate what you're talking about in a deeper and more critical fashion, and use appropriate academic vocabulary. Now, using appropriate academic vocabulary doesn't mean that you have to have an intense knowledge of really obscure literary terms. In fact, please don't. Okay? When we come across somebody when you're marking and they've got some really, really strange, obscure, and sometimes one that I almost have to look up myself, literary term that's being used, what does it say to me? It says either they've got this from somebody on TikTok, or their teacher has just said, "Oh, get this in," and it'll be good. So I'm not thinking of credit for them at all. It's just the ability to use the appropriate kind of vocabulary as you're writing. You'll see what I mean with that as we go further along. Right. Now, before I go any further into that, what I want to do is just give you a sense of what we mean by writing a level 6 discursively on the individual assessment objectives. Give you a few examples for these. Okay. Not so much, obviously can't do AO1 tasks because that's the whole response, but just some examples that have gained the levels that we're looking at before. And let me explain to you how they have. This is an inspector calls response, or part of an inspector calls response, in which this person was awarded, as you can see, level 6 AO2 at that particular point. So this is where they moved from level 5 into level 6. Okay, now, just to remind you, that is essentially a bullet point thing from the a bullet point from the examiner's handbook that we have. What we're really looking to see in AO2, that you analyse aspects of the writer's craft and really look closely at the effects of their choice, linking that closely to the meaning. So, right, Priestley uses women as a conduit for his socialist message to the public. There are millions and millions of Eva Smiths. The inspector's hyperbole represent the urgency of the gender inequalities needing to change. He's causing millions of women to die, and Priestley and the inspector as one example, Eva Smith as the trigger for that change. Everyone has a mother, a sister, a daughter, a wife, and the inspector grabs that connection and connects it to the solution he believes socialism is. See the point that I made there? There's bits in there where the grammar really loses it. Okay, but they're writing in exam conditions. You'll be writing in exam conditions. You can't be perfect necessarily as you're going along. But what actually is analysing their craft is the impact of the hyperbole. It's not spotting the hyperbole of millions and millions. It's not, oh, I know the word hyperbole, right? It's spotting that technique. If they'd said, by the way, the inspector's exaggeration, they'd have got the same mark. Just is better, obviously, for your argument if you know using the actual technique. But the inspector's hyperbole represents the urgency of the gender inequalities need to change. Now, we're looking at that idea of analysis of the craft. That's a brilliant example of it. You understand what that means. It's not having to explain itself in a lot of detail. It might take you a bit of thought to do so, but that sense that the urgency is there because he exaggerates it. That's why we say there's millions of millions, because it's urgent. He's closely looking at the impact of that technique. And then when he carries on and explains it's causing millions of women to die, and they use Eva Smith as a trigger for that change, everyone has a mother, sister, daughter, wife. And so the inspector grabs that connection and connects it to the situation he believes socialism is. That is looking closely at the effects of that choice. To take Eva Smith as a trigger for the millions of people and then point out that everybody has connections with a female relative, and therefore we kind of get that connection. To then suggest, linking closely to the meanings, that at the end, that's the point, therefore, he makes. He's not really talking about women. He's talking about socialism. He's grabbing that connection. He's grabbing that idea of women being exploited, okay, of the gender inequalities need to change. And he's using it to say, and the only way we can do that is socialism. Beautifully explained, beautifully put. That is an example of what we're looking for from level 6, okay? Now, it's discursive because you can see how it's building that idea of a discussion. It introduces the point, right? First of all, women are as a conduit. Even if you know the word conduit, it doesn't really matter. You can see what it means from what he's saying for his socialist message to the public. Clear point. Goes into the technique and then discusses the impact of that technique and how that leads and brings you around towards that solution. That is discursive writing, okay? Explaining what you're looking at. Now, here's another example, okay, of level 6, going this time to a power and conflict answer, all right, about the poem The Emigrant. However, in The Emigrant, nature is seen to alleviate the stress that the nature feels. This is seen through the epistrophe of sunlight, connoting positivity and optimistic views. The fact that each stanza ends with this suggests that despite the hardship of not being able to visit her country, her love for the place endures. However, the idea of being branded by an impression of sunlight implies that she's being lulled into a false sense of security, potentially highlighting her naivety that this home is not the place she expected it to be. Now, funnily enough, you've got epistrophe connoting positivity. And actually, that bit is the worst bit of the whole thing up there. It doesn't really make any sense. What makes this effective as a piece of discursive writing that achieves this is, again, the first sentence. The first sentence, the point that's being made, is in itself an interesting, complex analysis. Nature is seen to alleviate the stress that the nature feels. It deals with the writer's choice, the effects of the writer's choice right up at the beginning. That's something I'd say to you straight away. The first sentence in each point, get the effect in immediately, right? Lead with that, because that then makes the point there. Intrusive sunlight, and this seems a very, very basic point to begin with. But again, it's got that structural bit, analysing his craft. He's using it to end every stanza. Sorry, she's using it to end every stanza, okay? Despite the hardship of that, her love for the place endures. There's the interpretation of the fact that it's at the end of every stanza. And you can see that's where the first level 6 point begins to come in. It may seem a simple point, but it actually, because it's dealing with something complex, It alleviates the stress because ending it in every stanza means we see that despite the hardship, her love endures. Beautifully put together and therefore getting up to that high level. But what makes it even better is the discursive nature. It uses the however. It starts to consider this as a discussion. Hang on, there's a bit more to this. However, let's look at one of those examples. It says, branded by an impression of sunlight. Right, I'm going to talk about that idea of branding. No need to say the word branded. It just goes there. It implies she's being lulled into a false sense of security. Doesn't need to say any more about it. I know, so do you, that that's the word branded they're talking about. But they know, we know what branded means. We know it's what somebody does to you, right? It's an ownership thing, right? I know that. I'm intelligent, so's your examiner. That being brought in as part of the discussion takes that even further and confirms the level 6. Okay? By then saying that actually this might highlight her naivety. So it does alleviate the stress, but it may actually be a slight problem. Now, we move on to the next and we see, just so that you can understand here, because remember, it's all dealt with by individual assessment objectives. People often think, what's the difference between AO2 and AO1 refs? Well, not a huge amount, really, in some ways. But it's more about how well you use the references rather than the analysis and effect you do on them, how well you use them to back up your argument. And you can see here is another example from that same previous essay we had on Inspector Calls, where he talks about Mr. Burling's remarks about women. In fact, Mrs. Burling, go and look for the father of the child. The imperative and commanding go highlight the unfeeling nature of Mrs. Burling as a result of her capitalist views, affecting how she treats other women. She cleans her hands of the issue with father, pushing responsibility to another, and feels no guilt doing so. Now, there is AO2 in there, obviously, analysis of the imperative and all of that. But what I'm using as an example of here, and it was given that way, is how references, the two references, go and look for the father of the child, go and father from in there, how they are being used to back up an argument. The point here that it is Mr. Burling who has infected Mrs. Burling with his kind of attitudes. How do we prove that? Well, let's use this one. Let's use the idea of an imperative because it shows she's unfeeling. And let's consider how she is cleaning her hands of the issue with father as part of what's in there. Now, what that kind of shows you, this is one of the reasons why I've always been very, very wary of quote learning. Because, as I've mentioned in a previous one here before, a session we've done here before, it restricts you. If you're looking for this where you want to use a text reference dynamically, what you're looking for is the ability to choose really effectively. And if you've only got a certain number of quotes, you're going to have to push yourself towards using that example. Whereas if you know the text well enough, I mean, you don't even need to go and look for the father of the child here. You could just say, go, and the fact she refers to the father. You only need odd words and odd specific references. Just knowing the text gives you the chance of picking out references that are going to be effective for what you're saying. Okay. Now, once again, notice how the go then develops into cleaning her hands of the issue. She shows she's unfeeling, and it's as a result of her capitalist views. And then it takes us further in with a second piece of evidence to develop that idea of her cleaning her hands of the issue afterwards. Now, when we get on to AO3, again, I'm sure that many of you have had this hammered into you. I hope you have, that AO3 is not the context assessment objective. The word context is in there, but essentially the key frame is their purpose or their ideas. That's what it's about. It's basically about what the question is about. Whatever the question is asking you, if you focus in on that idea and discuss that idea, you're going to deal well with AO3. Now, for level 6, it's an overview of the whole text in terms of what the purpose is there. There may be contextual things that come in, but it's about that purpose. Now, here we get this idea. The collective we implies needing to support and help each other, especially women. And body, create the image of each individual component of the body coming together to function and survive, like Priestley hopes society will be able to, compared to the malfunctioning individualistic society with the gender inequalities which caused Eva's death. Now, first of all, what gets that in terms to a level 6 in terms of the clear overview? It's the point about the way that the body works. Yeah, each individual component of the body comes together to function and survive like Priestley hopes society will. So it takes a particular idea and links it in to what Priestley is trying to show us. Takes these bigger overall views and links it into what's being said. Yes, there is contextual stuff in here about especially women needing to support and help each other, and the gender inequalities down here, but it's just a part of what's being discussed. So it's getting the bigger ideas in at the heart of what you're saying, or coming out of what you're saying there. And in terms of the idea of discursive writing and building on it, again, it's really where you go after this point. It's a lovely put in here, the collective we need support and help each other, especially women. Body creates the image of this coming together to function, survive, like Priestley hopes society will be able to. Stop at that point, great. But it keeps the discussion going. He hopes it will be able to, compared to the malfunctioning individualistic society with the gender inequalities which caused Eva's death. And that last bit there, it's just taking that little bit further. Remember that list at the beginning of all the things that makes a discursive piece of writing. One of them is the ability to create a kind of sense of fluency in what's going on here. And the fluency of not just saying it's like Priestley wants, it's like saying how Priestley wants compared to what he's showing up here. Just takes it that little bit further. So there's one other here I just wanted to show quickly to you, because it just makes a point to you, which is very, very important, by the way, of how level 6 writing is often in the, it often comes up in the conclusion, especially AO3, how important the conclusion is, because by bringing together the big ideas, you often are achieving that description on the right, on the left there, a clear overview of what he's trying to do. Like here, to conclude, Priestley criticises the patriarchy and its ideas and clearly demonstrates the adversities women, especially the working class, experienced. Priestley aimed to convey his idea that women should not be held to a higher standard and then treated below and inferior to men. Alternately, he's pushing the audience to support Labour and socialist parties as they could fix these societal problems. You can see how bringing it together there is using relevant contextual ideas, bringing a bigger idea together. The conclusion is a brilliant place for looking at what is the writer trying to achieve and securing that level 6 in AO3 at the end. Okay, so there's an overview of those particular level 6s. Now, how does that look if we're putting those individual AOs? Sorry, how does that work if we're trying to put it together into what I'm saying is a piece of discursive writing, where you're bringing them together and you're creating a discussion? Right, have a look at this as another extract here. This is a section about Eric, okay, that has been written. It covers pretty much all of the assessment objectives. I'm not going to analyze necessarily how. What I'm going to look at here is how this creates a discussion. How this doesn't just say, this is what I think, Here's some examples. Done. It takes the idea and it develops it further, taking it sometimes in different directions, sometimes in more depth, like the things that we've just seen there, but always taking it further. From the very beginning of the play, we see that the character of Eric does not quite fit in with the others on stage. In the stage directions, he is described as half shy, half assertive, which suggests he's not comfortable in the situation and unsure how to behave. He would also be seated downstage, so he would have his back to us according to Priestley's plan, and would probably be the character we would pay least attention to. But as the act goes on, he seems to grow in confidence a little bit when expressing his opinions, questioning his father, what about war, and standing up for Eva and her fellow workers. Straight after we see his father say he has to come down on these people, we see Eric passionately question why they shouldn't try for higher wages, pointing out the hypocrisy as they do the same with prices. We're beginning to see that there is something different to Eric and that his opinions are more caring, certainly different from his father. Now, where are the others? Just from small things to show you the assessment objectives at that level. This, to me, is full of ideas of ways in which you can actually achieve this. Things that you can take from here today and put into your writing that will help you. Thinking from the beginning. Look at that use, again, of a kind of introductory, probably an adjunct really, isn't it? Added in at the beginning. Not just we see the character of Eric doesn't quite fit in. From the very beginning of the play. Very effective. Get straight in with whereabouts are you? Where in the play are you talking about? Here, it's making the point, not just I'm talking about the beginning of the play, the person writing there, but they're also very clearly saying, this is important. The first thing we see, the very beginning, this is set up. That is something that can easily be stolen from the very beginning of the play. As we move through Act 1, as Act 2 reaches its climax, phrases like that are things that are really effectively introducing a discussion because you are saying that its structure and where it's happening is important. And particularly, we're stealing the very. I love a use of very. That is clearly one of my students because they've stolen that from me because I do that all the time. From the very beginning of the play, the very first sentence of the extract, in other sense, that's the things that I tend to come up with. And then it makes it quite clear what the point is. We see that the character of Eric doesn't quite fit in with the others on stage. So having used that little adjunct at the beginning, it then states very clearly what the point is. And the point is focused around Priestley. It is not focused around Eric. It's being presented to us that he does not quite fit in. That in itself is already quite a high level observation, isn't it? It's telling us that we would notice that immediately. How would we notice it? It goes on to the stage direction of the half shy, half assertive, again, which suggests he's not comfortable. And then look at how this develops. The semicolon. The semicolon that says, and I've got more. And it's also something from the same place, the stage directions at the beginning. The word also added in. I don't really like the word also, but in this case, it fits very much. He would also be seated downstage. So having made that point about half shy, half assertive, showing he's not uncomfortable, he's not comfortable and unsure how to behave, it then backs it up, carries it on. Discursive movement. He would also be seated downstage and then interpret it. So he would have his back to. And what that would mean. So therefore, he would probably be the character we'd pay least attention to. A developed point. Two bits of evidence that are used in the same place. A semicolon. linking them together to show how one draws out of the other, discursive, identifying whereabouts it is, and the focus on we as an audience and the impact on the audience. They are all things I would recommend to you to be considering using in your writing. And then we get the connective. But the change of direction, the discourse marker that signals a move. But, and then, like from the very beginning of the play, as the act goes on, again, just telling us, I'm not just talking about what happens later, I'm talking about this first act. How this first act develops. Setting up perfectly that after this section, they could easily now move on to him later in the play. Remember, he disappears for the second act, but then could easily come back to him in the third act. But as the act goes on, he seems to grow in confidence a little bit when expressing his opinions. The word seems, phrase seems to, doesn't just introduce a discussion in terms of it's not clear, but this is my interpretation. It also says, audience. Guess who does it seem to? It seems to the audience that he grows in confidence. So again, good phrase. He seems to grow in confidence a little bit when expressing his opinions, questioning his father, what about war? And standing up for even her fellow workers. Now, the brackets, I wouldn't overuse brackets, but the brackets have been used there because it's essentially saying, isn't it? Here is an example of him questioning his father. I'm not actually going to talk about anymore. I'm not going to analyse it. It's in brackets because I'm just showing you quickly that it's an example of him doing it. What's more important is he stands up for even her fellow workers. And now I'm going to show you that. Straight after, from the very beginning, as the act goes on, we see this straight after that. Again, temporal connectives, connecting in terms of time or space in the play. Straight after, we see his father say he has to come down on these people. We see Eric passionately question why they shouldn't try for higher wages, pointing out the hypocrisy as they do the same with prices. Now, there's so much in that little section there, in that sentence there. First of all, I said to you about the use of subordination. Look at the use of subordination here. Straight after we see his father say he's got to come down these people, we see Eric passionately question why they shouldn't. Using the comparative bit as part of the subordinate clause beginning the sentence. It seems a small thing, but it is really helpful. Using subordination, the beginning of a subordinate clause, to introduce something to compare it to. So just after we've seen this, unlike when he did this before, differently to this character, all of those examples of introducing a subordinate clause at the beginning that just gives you a bit more analysis before focusing on the main point here, which is what Eric does. So that's the first thing that I would note to you to do, right? Subordination. Secondly, effective use of an adverb here. Just as easy, work with an adjective as well. We see Eric question. No, we see Eric passionately question. Doesn't need analysis. It doesn't need evidence to go there. It's going to come here. It's just pointing out that it's passionate. I've read the play. You've read the play. You know he is being passionate at this point. Passionately question why they should try for higher wages. And then continuing the sentence structure, the comma followed by the participle, the in verb, pointing out the hypocrisy as they do the same with prices. So what have we got? We've got, straight after this, we see this, the adverb to show you how important it is to him. And then afterwards, with a participle, another subordinate clause that shows you the effect. Beautifully, concisely written. The effect is there, the structure is there, the analysis is there, all tightly written in a single sentence. Okay? Writing discursively, using subordination. We're beginning to see that there is something different to Eric, and that his opinions are more caring and certainly different from his father. And then a pretty plain and straightforward sentence that then says, and what is the point then? What's the impact? Seeing all this, we are beginning to, and notice beginning to, again, still making the point, this is only the beginning part of it. Control of language. So effective in this. As another example there, I'll read through it to you, but I'm not going to go into as much depth on it, just showing you this in Power and Conflict in my last Duchess question from a few years ago. In my last Duchess, men are presented as self-centered and power-hungry, especially the Duke of Ferrara, dropped in clause there. There is heavy use of first personal pronouns, which highlights the possessive nature of men. My last Duchess also presents the idea, also carrying it on, that accompanying that much power causes paranoia. Her looks went everywhere. The greed of the Duke is portrayed with looks as he feels he should be the only one receiving them. It also depicts how he centralizes his needs of selfishness over the freedom and happiness of his life. He puts his own concern and insecurities over his wife and wishes to constrict and trap her. To ensure she never went anywhere again, he even killed her. Similarly, in London by William Blake, the selfish greed of men in power mirrors the Duke of Ferrara. These men feel entitled to nature itself, with Chartered representing the River Thames, and Blake criticises their self-imposed importance. It is a natural resource which should be free to all, and the river, untamed in nature, nice use of the drop-in clause there, is juxtaposed with its adjective chartered. The verb is emphasised through the structure of London, with or quartets which reflect the separate uniform sections of the Thames. Essentially, all the way through that, what you have, as you can see, is use of sentence structure, use of developed and constantly building points, and effective choice of language, mirroring this, juxtaposing this, emphasizing through the structure. Okay. It is quite complex, this stuff. But it is something, again, that maybe you haven't thought about as much. It's not me looking at individual texts and the things that you need to do in there. It's looking at ways in which your writing can ensure that you are achieving those objectives. There's lots of different ways to get to a level 6, but the one thing that will always be there is that sense of flow and development. The things that we can look at to do this is making sure that primarily, first of all, we have a clear and thoughtful thesis, which you then continue to discuss throughout your response. Okay? That is very, very important and significant. We look there at the way that connectives, both temporal, that is to do with time, as in before, after, previous, so those kind of ideas, previously. Connectives, temporal connectives that create a sense of structure and development, that show you the structure and the way that the text is developed, and also causal connectives. They are things like because, however, but, that establish a relationship between ideas. So connectives that temporal to use structure, to show development, causal to show relationship between ideas, and the use of complex sentences. Subordination and inserted clauses focus the reader on what you want to say and give appropriate priority levels to evidence and comments. In that sentence I showed you, the focus was really clearly, tightly on Eric passionately questioning his father, or questioning what's going on there. That was the focus. That's why that was the main clause. Okay, but before and after added more to it. So it gave to the examiner clear priority levels. It showed them what's the important bit, what's not as important, what adds more to it. And as I've said before, use your conclusion particularly with AO3, but with all kinds of things. So many marks are gained in conclusions. Honestly, you wouldn't believe how often that happens. Okay? So, complex, I know, to think about. But if you go away, think about, and you're trying this, it means you can condense and write much more discursively. That allows you to achieve these tough skills.